In the autumn of 554 AD, the Italian countryside lay in silence. Not the silence of peace, but the silence that follows exhaustion. For nearly 2 decades, the land had been torn apart by war. Villages burned, cities emptied, and corpses lay beneath crumbling aqueducts that once fed the lifeblood of an empire. Yet amid the ruins of this desolate Italy, one dream still burned. A dream born centuries earlier, the dream of Rome. To the east, across the Adriatic, that dream had a guardian. Emperor Justinian, ruler of the Eastern Roman Empire, believed his destiny was to restore what time had taken. He called it Renovatio Imperii, the restoration of the empire. To most, it seemed impossible. To Justinian, it was God's will. And in his service stood a man unlike any other, a eunuch, a court official turned general. His name was Narses. He was no warrior by birth, no blooded veteran of the frontier. He had spent decades in the palace at Constantinople, commanding not soldiers, but coin. Yet behind his calm, delicate face lay a mind as sharp as any sword. In his 70s now, he had become the emperor's instrument, the man who would finish what Belisarius had begun. The Gothic War had dragged on for nearly 20 years, pitting the might of the Eastern Empire against the remnants of the old Gothic kingdom of Italy. Under Totila, the Goths had fought Rome's armies to a standstill, defying even the great Belisarius himself. But in 552 the tide finally turned. At Taginae, Narses shattered Totila's army in a decisive clash. The Gothic king was struck down as his men broke and fled. Months later, near the shadow of Mount Vesuvius, the last Gothic forces under Taias made their final stand, and perished to the last man. By the winter of 552 it seemed over. Italy was Roman again. After generations of chaos, the eagle of Constantinople flew once more over the ruins of Ravenna and Rome. But beneath the surface, Italy was dying. The war had gutted the land, its farms ruined, its people starving. Bands of Gothic survivors hid in the hills. The countryside was haunted by hunger and plague, and beyond the Alps a new storm was brewing, the Franks. To the north, in the valleys of the Rhine, Frankish kings watched the fall of Italy with greedy eyes. They were not allies of the Goths, but opportunity makes strange friends. The death of Totila, the fall of the Gothic kingdom, these things had left Italy rich and undefended. And so, when whispers came from desperate Gothic envoys begging for aid, the Franks listened. Their king, Theudebald, was cautious. He would not send his own armies, but he would not stop those willing to go. 2 Alemannic brothers, Lutherus and Butulinus, answered the call. Fierce warlords of the Upper Rhine, they saw not a cause, but a fortune. By the spring of 553 they gathered 30,000 men, a vast host of Franks, Alemanni and barbarian adventurers, drawn by the scent of Italy's spoils. They crossed the Alps like an avalanche, thundering into the Po Valley. Their first target was Parma. The small Roman garrison there fell quickly. The invaders slaughtered the defenders, looted the town and burned it to the ground. News of the invasion swept through Italy like wildfire. Villages emptied before the invaders arrived. Others resisted and were annihilated. Many of the remaining Gothic bands in the north joined them, men who had lost everything now seeking revenge. In a matter of months, the Franks had become a new plague upon the land. In the south, Narses was caught off guard. After the victories at Taginae and Vesuvius, he had dispersed his army across central Italy to garrison key towns. His men were tired, and winter was approaching. So Narses made his headquarters in Rome, planning to rebuild supply lines and restore order. But war has a way of finding those who think it's finished. In early 554, scouts brought grim reports. The Franks were not retreating north. They were moving deeper into the heart of Italy. Town after town was falling. Churches were stripped of gold, monks crucified, children sold as slaves. The countryside screamed, and the emperor's banners were nowhere to be seen. Narses understood the danger at once. If the Franks were allowed to reach Campania or Apulia, they could ignite the war all over again. But his problem was numbers. His field army was small, perhaps 18,000 men, including contingents of Heruli, Armenians and regular Roman troops. against the 30,000 Franks and Alemanni. It was a dangerous gamble. Still, Narses had one weapon the Franks did not: discipline. He waited, watching, gathering intelligence. He knew that barbarian armies often carried their own doom: arrogance, greed, and disease. He could not afford rashness. He would wait for the enemy to tear itself apart, and soon that's exactly what happened. As the Franks advanced southward, their army began to splinter. Lutherus and Butellinus, brothers in blood but rivals in ambition, argued over how to divide the spoils of Italy. In Samnium, their dispute came to a head. Lutherus, restless and satisfied with plunder, decided to return north. Butellinus, driven by pride, vowed to stay, to conquer Italy itself and rule it as a new Gothic king. So the two brothers parted ways. Lutherus led his men toward Apulia, then to Otranto, and finally back toward the Alps. But his march home was cursed. At Fanium, his vanguard was ambushed by the Armenian general Artabanus, a veteran of Justinian's wars in Africa. The battle was brief but bloody. Hundreds of Franks were cut down, their wagons captured. The survivors fled north, only to be struck by plague in the mountain passes. Lutherus himself died before ever reaching home, his treasure rotting in the wagons behind him. Butellinus, meanwhile, pressed on toward the south. He had perhaps 20,000 men left, still a vast army, and in his mind enough to build an empire. But his dream was already rotting from within. Plague and dysentery swept through his camp. Men collapsed in the fields, their bodies piling along the road. The sweltering Italian summer turned the air into poison. By autumn, Butellinus's army was a shadow of what it had been. Still, he refused to turn back. He marched to the banks of the Volturnus river, near the ancient town of Casilinum not far from Capua, and made his stand. Here, Butellinus ordered a fortified camp to be built. Earthworks and ditches guarded the perimeter. The army's wagons were chained into walls. A bridge across the river was secured by a tall wooden tower, manned day and night by archers. It was a fortress, a barbarian city of wood and mud, and it was here that the fate of Italy would be decided. When word reached Narses in Rome that the enemy had halted by the Volturnus, he knew the moment had come. The Franks were weakened by disease and divided by ambition. Their camp was strong, but their morale was not. Narses gathered his generals, the Armenian Artabanus, the herald chieftain Sinduil, and the Roman commander Valerian, and laid out his plan. They would march south and crush the invaders once and for all. No retreat, no delay. By early autumn of 554, the Roman army began its march. From the ashes of war, from the ruins of a broken empire, an old eunuch led 18,000 men into the final campaign of the Gothic War. For 20 years, Italy had known only ruin and despair. But now, as the banners of the empire rose over the fields of Campania, one truth echoed through every legionary's heart. Rome had not yet died, and on the banks of the Volturnus she would prove it. The Roman army was on the move. From the gates of Rome, through the scorched fields of Campania, the columns advanced. 18,000 men bound south toward destiny. At their head rode Narses, the old eunuch who carried an empire's last hope on his shoulders. Every mile they marched reminded them what the war had cost. Once fertile valleys lay barren, broken aqueducts cut across the hills like bones. In the ruins of villas, weeds grew over marble floors where senators had once dined. Italy was a corpse still wearing the face of its former glory. And yet, from that corpse, something stirred. Roman discipline still lived, silent, measured, unbending. Far to the north, the cause of all this suffering still festered. The Frankish host that had poured through the Alpine passes a year earlier. Their invasion had not been a crusade of kings or the will of a nation. It had been greed made flesh, a barbarian tide drawn by the scent of gold and grain. When Lutherus died on his return journey, his surviving warriors staggered back across the Alps, bringing tales of fire, plague, and betrayal. But Butellinus, his brother, remained in Italy, the shadow still looming over the south. Among the Franks, he now called himself Rex Italii, King of Italy. It was a title born of arrogance and delusion, but one that spread fear through the countryside. His army, though reduced to perhaps 20,000, was still a terrifying sight. Bands of Alemanni, Saxons and disillusioned Goths marched under his banner. Their weapons were crude but deadly, their courage born of desperation. They believed Rome was finished, that a new barbarian kingdom could rise on its ashes with Volturnus as its war king. In their camp along the Volturnus, the Franks feasted on stolen grain and wine seized from Roman estates. The stench of sickness hung heavy in the air. Dysentery had swept through their ranks, but superstition kept them there. Their priests claimed the river's waters would purify them, that the gods of the land had blessed their conquest. Volturnus believed it. He ordered the camp fortified, earthen ramparts, trenches and wagons chained together into walls. Behind these defences his men built a wooden tower to guard the bridge across the Volturnus. It was their lifeline, their only escape if disaster struck. While Volturnus dreamed of kingship, Narses dreamed of closure. He had spent decades in imperial service, serving under emperors and schemers alike. He had no heirs, no titles to leave behind, only this final war. To end the Gothic nightmare once and for all was not just his duty, it was his redemption. As he advanced, Narses ordered his scouts to ride ahead and map the enemy position. The reports confirmed what he had hoped for. The Frankish army was large but sickly, their defences strong but static. They had trapped themselves between the river and their own arrogance. Narses smiled. He knew how to fight such an enemy. Among his army marched a strange coalition: Roman regulars, Byzantine cataphracts, Armenian cavalry, and Heruli mercenaries. These Heruli were fierce but volatile, men who lived for battle yet distrusted every order. Their chieftain, Sindual, had sworn loyalty to Narses, but even he struggled to hold his warriors in check. For days the Roman army moved southward, shadows stretching across the late summer plains. When they reached Campania, they saw the smoke of Volturnus's camp on the horizon. The stench of decay carried on the wind. Narses halted his army and studied the terrain. The Volturnus curved like a serpent, its banks soft with mud and reeds. Volturnus's camp stood on the far side, protected by the river and the wooden bridge. To attack head-on would be suicide. Narses needed patience and cunning. He sent forward a detachment of Armenian cavalry under the officer Caronangs, a quiet, ruthless man who had already bloodied the Franks once before at Farnham. His mission was clear: cut off their supplies, probe their defences, and strike where they were weakest. One night, under cover of darkness, Caronangs and his riders crept close to the Frankish lines. They captured several wagons of grain, then set one ablaze and drove it toward the bridge tower. The fire leapt skyward, consuming the wooden structure in minutes. The flames reflected on the river, a signal visible for miles. The Franks rushed to put it out, shouting in panic. For the first time, they realised their sanctuary was not safe. When Narses received word of the burning tower, he knew the moment had come. The enemy was exposed. Fear had begun its work. But before he could strike, disaster nearly unravelled everything. In the Roman camp, a Heruli captain murdered his servant in a drunken rage. Narses, ever disciplined, ordered the man executed on the spot. The Heruli erupted in fury. They shouted that no Roman had the right to judge one of their own. In protest, they refused to fight. Their chieftain, Sindual, pleaded with Narses for patience, promising to restore their loyalty. For a moment, the general hesitated. Without the Heruli, his flanks would be dangerously thin. But hesitation was a luxury Rome could no longer afford. Narses gave the order to prepare for battle. If the Heruli would not fight, he would fight without them. Across the river, Volturnus saw the movement in the Roman camp. 2 Heruli deserters had already warned him that the enemy was divided. They urged him to attack at once, to strike before Narses could bring order to his lines. Volturnus agreed. He gathered his men, shouting that the gods favoured them. The Franks formed their ranks, a deep wedge of armoured infantry, shields locked, spears thrust forward. It was the same formation that had crushed so many enemies before. At dawn, the wedge began to move, Drums pounded, the ground trembled, thousands of barbarian warriors surged toward the Roman centre. On the opposite hill, Narses watched in silence. He had arranged his army with cold precision. Infantry in the centre, archers behind and cavalry on both wings. He commanded the right, Artabanes and Valerian held the left. Behind the lines, the gap where the Heruli should have stood yawned like an open wound. Narses waited, motionless. The Frankish wedge thundered closer. The air filled with the clash of shields and the screams of war horns. The Battle of the Volturnus had begun. Winter deepened over Italy like a dying breath. The battlefields that had once echoed with the clash of swords now lay silent, carpeted with ash and snow. Yet beneath the surface, the war for Italy was not over. The Gothic resistance, though shattered, still burned in scattered embers, and Narses, ever the strategist, would stamp them out with cold precision. The campaign that followed was not one of glory, but of endurance. The eunuch general understood that armies could win battles, but empires were secured by fire and discipline. From Ravenna to the gates of Rome, he unleashed a systematic storm. Forts razed, garrisons starved, and every pass fortified. Where Totila had waged a war of motion, Narses waged a war of suffocation. The Gothic fortresses fell one by one, not in dramatic sieges, but in silent capitulations. Hunger and hopelessness were the new weapons of the East. Narses' men, a patchwork of Lombards, Heruli, Armenians and Roman veterans, advanced with terrifying unity. Each contingent was bound not by loyalty to Justinian, but by the iron will of their commander. He had forged them into a single machine, a wedge of fire cutting through the corpse of a ruined kingdom. When resistance did arise, it was crushed with ruthless clarity. In the mountains near Cumae, the Gothic holdouts rallied under one last banner. Teius, a soldier's king, brave but doomed. The final clash came beneath the smoking shadow of Vesuvius. The Goths fought like men who knew they would die, the Romans like men who could not afford to. Narses arrayed his army in a formation that would define his genius, a wide anchored line with a deadly centre wedge of infantry, the flame point of his assault. The Goths charged downhill, a roaring wall of shields and despair, only to meet that wedge like an axe biting into oak. For 2 days the battle raged amid blood and volcanic stone. Teius himself fought until his shield arm was severed, and still he pressed forward, holding his blade in the other. When he finally fell, the last king of the Goths died standing, surrounded by the silence of an empire reclaimed. Italy was free, but empty. Cities that had stood for centuries now lay in ruin. Fields once rich with grain were scorched black. Narses had delivered Justinian his victory, yet the triumph felt hollow, the land more graveyard than prize. Still, for the empire, this was resurrection. For the first time in a generation, the Roman eagle flew once more over Italy. The fire had consumed the Goths, but it had also scarred Rome itself. And in Constantinople, Justinian's dream burned brighter than ever. He had reclaimed the West, but now the question was whether he could hold it. When the message of victory reached Constantinople, Justinian stood before the map of the empire, and for the first time in centuries the old borders were whole again. From the sands of Africa to the mountains of Illyria, and now the Italian peninsula, Rome was reborn. On parchment the dream had returned, but maps lie. Behind every coloured line was a country drained to dust. Italy, once the beating heart of empire, now lay silent beneath the weight of 20 years of war. Cities stood hollow, their marble streets littered with the bones of 2 nations. Ravenna was a ghost, Rome a carcass stitched together by imperial decree. Famine, plague, and desolation clung to the land like shadows that no triumphal decree could drive away. Yet in Constantinople, the victory was celebrated as divine proof. Processions filled the hippodrome. Gold mosaics glittered in the Hagia Sophia, proclaiming the emperor's glory as God's chosen ruler on earth. Narses, the eunuch general who had delivered the impossible, entered the capital not as a warrior but as an instrument of Justinian's will. His triumph was Justinian's alone. Justinian's reign was marked by contradiction. He had restored Rome's dominion, but at a cost his empire could scarcely bear. The treasury bled from constant campaigns, in Italy, in Africa, and now on the eastern frontier where the Persians stirred again. The emperor's ambitions stretched from the Atlantic to the Euphrates, but his resources did not. The West, newly conquered, was defenceless. Gothic Italy was Roman again, only in name. Its people starved beneath Byzantine tax collectors and the ruins of war. In their desperation, they began to see little difference between Gothic kings and distant emperors. The dream of restoration had become an empire too wide for its own heartbeat. Still, Justinian pressed on, rebuilding, codifying, reshaping the empire's image as eternal. His laws, the Corpus Juris Civilis, would outlive the stones of his cities. His church, the Hagia Sophia, would outshine the ruins of Rome. Yet his victories cast long shadows. As the old world flickered back to life, the flame of its rebirth threatened to consume the empire itself. By the time Justinian died in 565, the map of his conquest gleamed in the dim torchlight of his court, but the world it represented was already fading. Italy, Africa, and Spain were Roman again, but their people whispered in other tongues, under banners that would not last. The empire had been remade in his image, brilliant, fragile, and haunted, and so the dream of a dead empire was reborn, but only as a reflection, shimmering on the surface of a world forever changed. The dust had settled. Italy was quiet again, but it was a silence born not of peace but of exhaustion. The fields that had once fed empires now lay empty. Cities like Naples, Ravenna, and Rome itself stood as hollow monuments, their marble scarred, their people gone. The Tiber drifted past abandoned mills. The songs of the Forum had faded to whispers of ghosts. For the first time in centuries, Rome no longer ruled her own world, even as her banner flew once more above her ruins. In Constantinople, Emperor Justinian could claim that his dream was fulfilled. The map of the Mediterranean again gleamed with imperial gold, stretching from Carthage to Sicily, from Rome to the walls of Byzantium. But this restoration had come at a terrible cost. The Gothic War had lasted nearly 20 years. Entire generations of Italians had vanished. Soldiers, farmers, artisans, leaving behind a land shattered beyond repair. Justinian's triumph was a monument to endurance, not to prosperity. He had reunited the empire, but only in name. The cities of Italy, Spain, and Africa were no longer the bustling provinces of old. Their treasuries were drained, their trade severed, their populations decimated by war and plague. The historian Procopius, once Justinian's own chronicler, wrote bitterly of the emperor's ambition. He called him a man never satisfied with peace, but driven to endless conquest, until even the victors were left destitute. To Procopius, this was not the rebirth of Rome. It was the ghost of an empire trying to remember how to live, and yet, for a brief, flickering moment, the dream had lived again. For the veterans of Narses' army, the victory at Casilinum was remembered as the last time the Roman legions, true Roman legions, marched across the fields of Italy as masters of their fate. They had fought beneath the old standards in the name of an emperor who still claimed to rule the world. The name Romanus still meant something proud, something ancient. But history would not stop for them. Only 15 years after Narses' triumph, a new storm broke across the frontiers. The Lombards. They came not as allies, but as conquerors. In 568, their long-haired warriors swept down from the north, seizing one city after another. Narses, old and nearly forgotten, could only watch the empire's final Italian provinces crumble. The dream Justinian had rebuilt with blood and gold dissolved into dust once more. Rome had been resurrected, but her resurrection was brief. By the time the century turned, the western provinces had again fallen to barbarian kings. The Byzantine governors clung only to fragments. Ravenna, Naples, the toe and heel of the peninsula. The once mighty Exarchate of Italy became a distant outpost of Constantinople, its power shadowed by local dukes and fading loyalty. And yet, even in decay, the idea of Rome endured. In every stone basilica, in every Latin prayer whispered in the ruins, in the roads that still cut straight as an arrow through the broken hills, the Roman world refused to die. The Gothic War had not restored the empire, it had transformed it. From a kingdom of marble and legions into a memory, a myth, a dream that refused to vanish. From that dream would rise the next ages of Europe, the kingdoms of the Franks, the Lombards, the papacy, and beyond them, the distant echoes of empire that would one day call themselves holy and Roman. Each would claim the mantle of Rome, but none would ever truly wear it again. So ended the last great chapter of the ancient world, the final campaign in which the legions of Rome marched for their emperor, the last war fought to keep alive an empire that had already passed into legend. At the Volturnus River, in that autumn of 554, Narses had done what no general after him would ever do. He had brought Rome back to life, if only for a heartbeat in the long centuries of history. That heartbeat still echoes through every stone road, every broken aqueduct, every ruined amphitheatre that once bore witness to the greatness of the Roman name. And as the sun sets over the ruins of Casilinum, we remember, empires may fall, kings may fade, and armies may turn to dust, but Rome, in spirit, endures. Not as a place, not as a crown, but as an idea. The idea that power can be reborn, that civilization can rise again from ashes, as it did, one last time, beneath the banners of Justinian and Narses. The final resurrection of Rome, the last dream of empire and the end of the ancient world. The centuries rolled forward, empires rose, fell, and were forgotten. But the story of Justinian's Rome, the empire that died and lived again, never vanished. Long after the Volturnus ran clear of blood, the memory of that final Roman victory became something larger than history. It became legend. Monks in darkened scriptoria copied the tales of Belisarius and Narses, setting them beside Caesar and Scipio, as if they were one unbroken line of destiny. In the ruins of Ravenna, the mosaic still glittered in candlelight, gold and blue glass forming the image of Justinian, eyes fixed beyond the world, staring into eternity. To those who saw him, it was not a man, but an idea made flesh. The idea that Rome could never truly die. In time, that idea would pass into the hands of others. The popes of Rome would guard it as spiritual heirs. The Lombards, the Franks, and the emperors of the Holy Roman Empire would all claim it as their birthright. Even distant monarchs, from Charlemagne to Napoleon, would march beneath eagles and laurels, chasing the ghost of a city that once ruled the world. But the true legacy of Rome was never its conquests, it was its endurance, the stubborn belief that order could rise from chaos, that learning could outlast darkness, that even in ruin there is renewal. The Battle of Casilinum was not merely a clash of arms, it was the last spark of an ancient civilization trying, one final time, to hold back the night. When Narses stood upon that blood-soaked plain, his victory was not only for Justinian nor for empire, but for the very idea that humanity could rebuild what had been lost. That belief became the bridge between worlds, from the marble colonnades of Antiquity to the vaulted cathedrals of the Middle Ages. Through that bridge walked the scholars of Byzantium, the thinkers of the Renaissance, and the dreamers of every age who looked back to Rome and whispered, "We are her children." The echoes of that empire still live in the words we speak, the laws we follow, the cities we build. Every arch and every road still carries the mark of her hand. And though her legions are gone, her voice endures, quiet, measured, unbroken, reminding the world of what once was and what could be again. The Battle of Casilinum was not the end of Rome, it was her final heartbeat, a moment when history itself seemed to stand still, to breathe once more before fading into legend. And even now, as the centuries stretch like shadows across time, that heartbeat still lingers. In every empire that dreams of greatness, in every civilization that rises from ruin, and in every human soul that refuses to surrender to the dark. Rome lives, not in the stones of her ruins, but in the will to rebuild them. That is her true resurrection, her eternal echo, her final triumph. More than 1,000 years have passed since the armies of Narses stood on the banks of the Volturnus. The sound of swords and shields has long faded, but the idea they fought for never truly left the world. Rome's legacy was never buried with her ruins. It flowed through the centuries like a hidden current, shaping everything that came after. From the law codes of Justinian that still form the backbone of modern justice, to the domes and arches that inspired every cathedral and capital, the spirit of the eternal city became the foundation of the West. What began as conquest became culture. What was once empire became memory, and from memory, myth. In the heart of Constantinople, the empire of Justinian endured for another 9 centuries, weathering storms that would have broken lesser realms. Even when its walls finally fell in 1453, the men who died upon them still called themselves Romans. For them, the empire had never ended, only changed its shape. And in that belief lay Rome's true immortality. Through every empire that followed, the Carolingians, the Ottomans, the Holy Roman Emperors, and even the nations of the modern world, Rome became a mirror, a dream reflected across time. Some sought to rebuild her glory, others to escape her shadow, but none could forget her. Every generation has returned to her story, to the rise and fall of her power, the endurance of her law, the reach of her faith. Rome is not only history, she is an inheritance. The legions may be gone, the emperor's dust, the marble cracked and sun-bleached, but her heartbeat continues. In our architecture, our politics, our languages, even our imagination of what civilization means. And it all came down to those final battles in the heart of Italy. The wars of Justinian, the victories of Belisarius and Narses, the blood spilled at Casilinum. Those moments decided not just the fate of an empire, but the survival of an idea that no collapse is final and no darkness is eternal. For in every age, Rome's legacy reminds us that empires are mortal, but civilization can be reborn. The eternal city may have fallen, risen and fallen again, but her influence became the pulse of humanity itself. From the Forum to the Capitol, from the mosaics of Ravenna to the marble of Washington, her shadow still lies across the world. And perhaps that is how Rome truly lives. Not as a power of legions and gold, but as a whisper carried through the centuries telling every civilization that comes after, rise again, remember what we built, and do not forget who you are, because in the end, the story of Rome is not only the story of a city or an empire, it is the story of civilization itself, and its last great battle, the clash at Casilinum in 554 AD, was not just the end of the ancient world. It was the first heartbeat of the world we live in today. The world that Rome built has changed beyond recognition, yet somehow her voice still reaches us. From the ruins of the Palatine to the glass towers of modern cities, her reflection flickers everywhere. In our laws, our languages, our architecture, our dreams of order and greatness. Every empire that has ever risen since has felt her presence. A reminder, a warning, a challenge. The Romans called it fatum Romanum, the destiny of Rome, the belief that their legacy was eternal, that their story would never end. They were right, in a way they could never have imagined. Rome's destiny was not to last forever, but to teach forever, to show that no civilization is too mighty to fall, and no ruin too deep to rise again. When we study Justinian's reconquest, his armies marching beneath the crimson banners, his cities rebuilt from ash, his empire reborn in fleeting glory, we're not only looking into the past, we are looking into a mirror. Because every age believes itself permanent, every power imagines it stands at the summit of history, and every civilization in time must face its own Volturnus, its moment of reckoning when ambition meets reality and ideals are tested against time itself. That is the true gift Rome left us, not the illusion of immortality, but the lesson of endurance, the strength to rebuild, the courage to remember, The same roads that once carried legions now carry travellers. The same aqueducts that once fed empires now inspire engineers. The same mosaics that once glorified emperors now whisper to historians and artists who still search for meaning among the ruins. If Rome's story teaches anything, it is this. Power fades, beauty crumbles, knowledge sleeps, but the will to build returns. Civilization is a fire passed from age to age. The Romans tended it once, we hold it now. And perhaps one day, far in the future, when our own monuments have turned to dust, another people will walk among our ruins and ask, as we once asked of Rome, who were they? What did they build? What did they leave behind? The answer will depend not on what we conquer, but on what we preserve. Because the story of Rome was never truly about empire. It was about memory, the will to learn, to endure, to begin again. From the marble hearts of the Caesars to the quiet courage of those who rebuilt after ruin, that spirit lives on, not in thrones but in thought, not in conquest but in creation. The empire has fallen, the idea endures, Rome is gone, Rome is everywhere. Her echo moves through time, in the hum of cities, in the language of law, in the pulse of every civilization that dares to dream of greatness. The eternal city still speaks, not in Latin but in the language of humanity itself, and as long as we remember her story, Rome will never fall.